Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, where we talk all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne, beginning this time with an unusual rune. Seedbed, a carol visited upon Adeline, patient of the experimental ward. It is a phonetic representation of an inhuman voice, the whispering of the damp sound, and reveals the way of being an attendant of the stars. Those under this contract become the trunk of a starflower that faces the sky, and as a seedbed they allow spirits to live within. Spirits are guides and will likely bring about further discoveries. Clearly, there's a lot going on both with the lore of this rune and its translation, but for me, the broadest and most striking creative choice can be found in its name. From a literal perspective, this rune shouldn't be translated as milkweed at all, but unlike some of the discrepancies we've seen between the English and Japanese text, this one seems to me like a deliberate choice. Honestly, I think it makes a lot of sense. To understand why, though, we'll need to consider some other aspects of this rune's description, as well as how it can be used in the game. So first things first, let's take a look at the central part of the item text to get a sense of what this rune is meant to represent. Here we find out from the official English that the rune reveals the nature of a celestial attendant. This is a perfectly accurate and highly polished translation, but in order to drill further down into the core idea of what's being expressed, I want to examine what's going on in the original language anyway. The relevant phrase is hoshi no kaizoe taru arikata, where that last term, arikata, is used to express either the way something ought to be or the current state of things. I've translated this extremely literally as way of being, but I think you can see why the official translation would use the term nature instead, because what is a thing's nature if not something fundamental to the way that thing exists? But while this particular word choice tells us that the rune is meant to express the essence of an existential state, we still need to nail down what exactly that state is. To do so, we have to turn to the preceding phrase, hoshi no kaizoe taru, which I would argue can be further broken down into two key parts, a noun phrase and a grammatical element. Thankfully, the noun phrase, hoshi no kaizoe, is relatively straightforward in terms of meaning. Hoshi means celestial object or star, and kaizoe means attendant, so we get either attendant of the stars or celestial attendant. It's only when we get to the grammatical element, taru, that things start to get tricky. This is an expression that identifies all who hold a certain status or position, often with the implication that a true member of the identified group should do something or be a certain way. So you could use the phrase gakusei taru mono, where gakusei means student and mono means person, to identify everyone who would belong to the category of student and then make a pronouncement about a minimum qualification everyone in that class should meet. An example sentence might be gakusei taru mono benkyou subeki de aru, which would literally translate to something like, all who consider themselves students ought to study. But to bring this back to Bloodborne, the grammatical taru is being used to identify all beings who would function as attendants of the stars. However, rather than making a pronouncement, this phrase is modifying the word for nature or way of being that I discussed earlier. In other words, the precise thing this rune is said to reveal is the requisite state of being to function as one who assists and cares for celestial objects or beings. So having established the abstract concept that this rune reveals the nature of a celestial caregiver, let's move on to the rest of the description for some more concrete information. Fortunately, we won't have far to look. Right in the next line, we'll learn that those who take this as their oath rune transform into the base part of a starflower. Notably, this is also where the rune's function in the game becomes relevant, because while that might sound metaphorical in a text description, anyone who's equipped this rune knows that it's literally true. When you have it in your oath rune slot, you transform into something that looks like a plant. This is important because, as the subsequent line in Japanese informs us, it is in this plant-like form, not that of a specially prepared bed of soil, that those with this rune equipped function as seed beds by letting spirits dwell within. As a result, I'm inclined to think that the Japanese term for seedbed is being employed more for the metaphor of a nurturing environment than anything else, and thus is being used to reinforce the idea of becoming a kind of caregiver for celestial beings. Furthermore, it's crucial to bear in mind that in the world of Bloodborne, the word seide, which I've literally translated as spirits, and which the official English calls phantasms, is the umbrella term the Healing Church uses for mollusks or invertebrates. This gives us an image of the hunters who take on this oath rune as plants, while those they nurture are depicted as invertebrates living on them. Based on this image, as well as the connotations of nurturing and care that I see as the main idea behind the use of the term seedbed, I can think of few better encapsulations of this idea than that of the milkweed plant. From what I was able to find out online, this plant is a major source of food for insects of all kinds, and of course it is most notable for its association with monarch butterflies. Apparently, the butterflies only lay eggs on milkweed plants, and the resulting caterpillars, which also happen to be invertebrates, use the leaves as their exclusive source of food. So by calling this the milkweed rune, the translators are able to tie in the plant transformation and the concepts of both nurturing and sheltering invertebrates. What's more, thanks to the strong association between milkweed and monarch butterflies, the official English is able to subtly hint at the theme of transformation in a way the original Japanese does not. Given all those upsides, I can see why the translators would make this creative choice. But having covered that, let's turn to the last item we have that's tied to Adeline. Balcony key. Key to the door of the balcony on the first floor of the experimental ward. Thing passed to patient Adeline by Maria of the clock tower so that at least the outside air and the scent of flowers might become a relief for her. However, she could not understand that. Obviously, this item is a lot simpler than the last, but there are still some aspects of the translation that are worth pointing out. To begin with a relatively subtle point, notice the uniform clarity of the official English when it comes to who or what is being talked about. Literally, the last two lines of the Japanese only use feminine pronouns to refer back to an understood subject, whereas the translators have mostly used the names Maria and Adeline. The only time they make use of the pronoun her, it's after they've made sure it's easy to understand that they mean Maria. This is an aspect of good English writing that it can be surprisingly easy to lose track of when translating from Japanese, since it's much more common to drop subjects and rely on references and contextual understanding in that language. For example, look again at the final sentence in Japanese. Literally, all it consists of is the statement that she couldn't understand that. To make sense of it, though, there are two things you have to realize from context. First, you need to keep in mind that the word she is being used to refer to Adeline, just like in the preceding sentence where the Japanese term is used in connection with the relief or healing provided by the outside air and the scent of flowers. However, that information is relatively easy to keep track of compared to what exactly is being referenced by the word for that. It's actually referring back to the wish outlined only by grammatical implication in the previous sentence. That is, the hope that Adeline might be soothed by what she could experience out on the balcony. For this reason, I love that the translators have not only identified Adeline as the subject of the final line using her name, but that they've also made it clear that it's Maria's intentions that Adeline couldn't fathom. This takes all the guesswork out of the Japanese, and therefore gives the official English text a clarity that I think elevates it over a more literal version, even if a native English speaker could probably still understand my rougher translation. Despite this careful grammatical work, though, I have more mixed feelings about the translation of the preceding line. On the one hand, I'm a fan of the evocative phrasing used to portray the scent of flowers being carried on the wind. But on the other, I'm worried about the way this presentation conflates two comforts into one and potentially confuses players. In Japanese, the particle to, which is used to indicate items in a complete list, makes it clear that it's both the scent of flowers and the outside air that Maria thinks will help Adeline. Furthermore, the phrase "from the outside" at the end of the official English sentence makes me think of some desolate prison balcony where only the hint of a breeze from outside can come through. However, as you'll see when we do access the balcony, it actually overlooks a flower garden impossibly also enclosed in part of the other Grand Cathedral. To be fair, the translators probably didn't have access to the layout of the Hunter's Nightmare to make sense of this information. But then again, short of this being another case of outdated English text, I have to imagine there was a way to avoid this confusion. With the benefit of hindsight, I'd consider something like Maria had hoped Adeline would find comfort in the open air, where she might be soothed by the scent of flowers on the wind. Of course, that's a pretty minor issue in the grand scheme of things, and on the whole, I like this translation, much like that of our next item. Underground prison key. key to the Grand Cathedral's underground prison. The underground prison imprisons hunters, so that things that should not be seen, information that should not be known, will all darkly rot away to nothing. Here we have another translation with a lot of nice touches that appears to suffer because of a lack of knowledge of the in-game environment. Interestingly enough, we can actually see both of these elements right in the name of the item. To begin with the more subtle side of things again, viewers with a sharp memory may recall that we've actually seen the word chicaro before. Back when our player character was defeated by a large enemy that attacked with a sack, we found ourselves kidnapped and brought to a location identified in English as the Hypogean Jail. As I've mentioned previously, the Japanese name for this place literally consists of the kanji for below, ground, and prison, which add up to chikaro. That's the exact same word we see being used in the Japanese name for this key. It's probably in part for this reason that the opening line specifies that this specific underground prison is located beneath the Grand Cathedral. Of course, in English, the two very different names help draw a natural distinction between the locations in question. I find this interesting because it's one of the comparatively few times in Bloodborne that it's clear no direct connection is intended between these place names, even though the same word is being repeated in both. Also, note that while I previously mentioned I was worried the translators went too far in making Hypogean Jail sound distinctive at the cost of understandability, if they had used a more straightforward translation earlier, this particular location name may have the same issue of potentially confusing repetition as the Japanese. But for all that the official English names keep these two places distinct, there's another aspect of this translation that doesn't seem to match what we see in the game. In English, the item text exclusively refers to a single cell below the Grand Cathedral. However, anyone who's used this key before will know that it actually opens 3 different cells in what appears to be an admittedly small hallway that leads up from the underground corpse pile into one of the Nightmare Grand Cathedrals. Given that, a more literal interpretation of the Japanese kanji for prison or jail seems like it would be more accurate. Of course, because this is the sort of information it's difficult to parse correctly without playing the game, and translators only rarely get the opportunity to actually do so, I don't blame the localizers for not knowing exactly what the situation with the cells would look like. Besides, it's always possible they were working off of text that was later updated on the Japanese end of things. Whatever the reason for this confusion though, there's still a lot of things to like about the official translation. And that goes beyond just the differentiation of place names. For instance, take the way they've reworded the second line of the description so it doesn't sound like the repetitive presentation of obvious information. Or how they've deliberately used the formulaic phrasing, subject better left unverbed, to mirror the Japanese verb begidenai noun, in a way that also calls back to the similarly worded dialogue we heard back when we talked to one of the prisoners earlier. Finally, consider the addition of the word fallow to the final line. Together with the mention of decay, this suggests another plant-based metaphor that hints at the idea that the Healing Church hopes to gain from whatever they're hiding, because while the darkness in question may currently be dormant, it could end up bearing fruit in the future. All of these touches are comparatively subtle, but each one adds up to make this description a lot more striking than its literal counterpart, while also conveying most of the same information. But having established that, I want to return now to the subject of item names, because this next piece of equipment provides an interesting contrast to the situation with the underground cell key. Loch Shield, an artisanal shield coated in blue glass, used in special Healing Church rituals to protect the ritualists. Later given to tomb raiders, particularly those descending into the underground ruins of Ys. That blue is modeled after a lake, and its reduction of all but physical damage is high. So, as I was mentioning before providing that full comparison, there is a noticeable difference between the official and the literal version of this item name. Literally, this is simply the Loch Shield, with the exact same kanji being used here as on all the various lake runes. Lore-wise, this connection makes a great deal of sense. Just as the lake runes invoke the concept of great bodies of water to serve as a bulwark against different types of damage, so too does this shield, though apparently its physical defense isn't particularly notable. But understanding this makes the official English name for the item stand out as a translation choice, because choosing the term loch for the shield as opposed to lake for the runes introduces variety into the English where it doesn't exist in the Japanese. Unlike with the underground cell key, though, that variation doesn't distinguish between two unrelated locations. It simply provides an alternate name for something meant to tie in with the same overall concept. However, that's not to say that I think this is a confusing or bad decision. I'm actually a big fan of this creative variation, and there are two chief reasons why I think it works. First, thanks in part to the widespread familiarity with the Loch Ness Monster in the English-speaking world, a lot of native English speakers are aware of the word loch being used for lakes in Scotland. Second, and possibly more importantly, there's the use of the more traditional translation for the Japanese term mizumi in the item description. This allows those who either weren't thinking of the Scottish term or aren't familiar with it to still realize that the shield was modeled after a lake and draw the lore connection anyway. Plus, as we've seen from a number of the creative choices in this episode, this decision arguably ends up adding some extra nuance to the English version of the item. In this case, the use of the term loch as a unique word that still carries the underlying meaning of lake could be said to mirror the unique instantiation of the concept of a lake into a shield as opposed to a rune. In other words, both the item and its name represent the same generalized idea being given a specific form that's unique. But as intriguing as I find the decision to introduce some variety into this item name, there's one potential discrepancy in the description itself that I want to address before ending the episode. You may have noticed that in my literal version, I said the shield was used in rituals to protect ritualists, whereas the official translation is that it was originally used to safeguard the leader presiding over a sacred healing church ceremony. As big of a difference as there is between those statements, though, the Japanese could actually be interpreted either way. In large part, this comes down to the unclear nature of singular versus plural in Japanese. Without further specification, gishiki and gishikisha could mean either ritual and ritualist, or rituals and ritualists. Given that, if we take the singular form to be more likely, as is often the case, it's not hard to then make the next interpretive leap. Basically, if we see the one ritualist named in the description to be the sole person responsible for performing this special healing church ritual, then saying that person is a leader presiding over a sacred ceremony makes a lot of sense. However, since there's an explicit plural used to call out multiple tomb raiders later in the text, part of me wonders if we're meant to imagine several of these shields being used in several ceremonies to protect numerous ritualists. That would make it easier for me to imagine multiple shields being given to multiple groups of explorers descending into the various underground ruins. Again, this particular line could really be interpreted either way. That may not be the most comforting thought to bring the episode to a close on, but at least I can say that as far as I'm aware, this is a minor enough point of lore that it doesn't really impact much however you make sense of it. Still, I wanted to bring it up because it serves as an interesting reminder of just how open the Japanese language can be to interpretation, and the inescapable role that plays in translation. Of course, if you feel like sharing some of your own interpretations or impressions of this episode with me, I'd love to hear them. Your feedback is always appreciated. Alternatively, if you'd like to hear my thoughts on any of the other subjects I've covered so far, remember that you can check the Translationborne index linked below, which should be up to date within 24 hours. Until next time then, thanks for watching everyone.